Hello and welcome to episode 11 of How to Code Games in BBC Basic. In this video, we're going to be looking at setting up a new level. Okay, so as we left off in the last video, we were in proc play and we noticed that one of the first steps that the master loop will do, in fact the only step that it does before then kicking into the nested loop, is it calls proc setup game. And as we discussed last time, this is a procedure which controls the creation of a new level. It doesn't necessarily have to be the first level in the game, because the variables that control which level the player is on are actually controlled or at least initialized by proc play, which you can see here. It sets the start percentage variable to 0, and if the player manages to complete a level successfully, it increments that by 1. But so proc setup game doesn't actually care which level the player is on. As far as it's concerned, it's just creating a new level, and that could be level 1, or it might well be a future level if the player has already completed a previous level. And the same procedure can be used multiple times, which is one of the flexibilities of procedures and why they're really great to use when you're constructing a game. So the first thing that it does is it clears the screen, which makes sense because what it's then going to do is actually draw a bunch of stuff on the screen, and what you wouldn't want to happen is have all of that being drawn across the instructions page or across the high scores table, which was on the preceding screen, because that would look very messy and doesn't really give a very clean effect for the setup of the game. So as I say, first command, clear the screen. Then before it jumps into the procedures that actually set up the game itself and draw all the relevant stuff on the screen, it creates some values for various variables. Some of them are more obvious than others. Now this first set of 4 here, O, P, Q and R, are particularly mysterious, and without actually further understanding the game in more detail, it wouldn't be clear at all if you were to come to this line of the program of why these are being set in the way that they are. So we could ignore them and just carry on and see what else is happening here, but I think it's important to at least give some understanding as to what these variables are for. We will investigate how they're controlled and why we need them in future videos, but at least for now, let's get a basic understanding of what they are and what their purpose is. So if you think back to the Cosmic Invaders game, and I will just bring it back up on the screen here, when you look at the game, you can see that the initial grid of aliens is drawn on the screen, and it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 aliens across by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 aliens down. So we know that from the dim array that that's how that's set up, and you might think, perhaps there's a relationship here between certainly the P percentage and the R percentage, because if we index from 0, as everything tends to do in BBC Basic, 6 really means 7, and 4 really means 5. So that actually gives us the 7 across and the 5 down of the alien grid. So just to verify that again, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is our grid of cosmic invaders, as we know. And it's true that these variables really do have a relationship with that array. So although they don't control the actual display of the aliens within the grid itself, that's handled elsewhere, they are important for that overall grid. And if we take a look in this sort of grid format, if you imagine the start of the level, the space percentage array which controls the grid of aliens, all of the values within that array are effectively set to true, which means that there will be an alien displayed in each one of those boxes, and that corresponds to the 7 across and the 5 down that we can see, but obviously indexing from 0. So our P percentage 6 corresponds to the fact that we've got 6 across, and our R percentage 4 corresponds to the number that we have down. Now what these variables do, it depends on what happens in the game later on. So if we think about it in this sense, the P percentage variable is used to indicate when a whole column of aliens has been eradicated from the right-hand side of the grid. If that happens, so if the player manages to kill all of the aliens in that column on the far right, then P percentage will decrement or decrease by 1. So it started off as 6, it's now gone down to 5. What that means is that the furthest edge, if you like, of the array is actually now at the 5 position rather than the 6 position. Uh, Correspondingly, R percentage controls when an entire row of aliens has been removed from the bottom. So if a player kills all of the aliens in this bottom row, then R percentage also decrements by 1. And that means that the edge of our grid at the bottom is now the third position of the array rather than the fourth, which it started off as. Now, it's important to understand that if even so much as one alien is still here, so if this value here was actually true, then our value of R would still be 4, because it doesn't matter that we've killed all these other aliens here. The fact is there's still one in that position, and that means that that is still the outer edge of the grid. But as soon as that alien is eradicated, then this value would go down to 3 to show that that is the furthest down, if you like, of the grid. Now, correspondingly, our O percentage increments by 1 whenever a column of aliens is destroyed on the far left-hand side, because again, it's showing that now position 1 of the array is the furthest left-hand edge, and obviously, as before, P percentage is showing the far right hand side as position 5. And you can probably guess now what Q percentage is doing. Q percentage is controlling the top edge of the grid. So if you kill all of the aliens in this particular row, then you would expect Q percentage to increase by 1, because now this is the top edge of the grid at position 1. If you were to destroy any of the columns inside the grid, for example here, it doesn't matter. These variables will remain completely unaffected, because although you've killed an entire column of aliens here, it doesn't have any effect on the outer edges of the overall grid itself, and so those variables remain constant, or at least they remain whatever values they were before. So that's what they're doing. That's what those 4 variables are for. And obviously, because this is the start of a new level, we want to make sure that O is 0, P is 6, Q is 0, and R is 4, because that indicates the outer edges of the Cosmic Invader grid. And it really means that we have got a full grid of aliens. Their purpose, we'll see in future videos, is to do with controlling the movement of the aliens from left to right and up and down. But that's something that we'll look at in a future video. Now, the next variable across at the beginning of the level is B percentage. What this one is doing is it's controlling the X position of our player's character. So if you think of plotting the player's position on a screen, if we look at Cosmic Invaders at the start, you can see that our player is here, and that means that he is essentially only 1x%, well, not percent, sorry, 1x position across. Now his Y position is controlled as a static value, because in this game we can't move the player up or down, we can only move it left or right, but its initial position is here on the far left hand side of the screen, and that is what that B percentage value is doing. The next one across in the procedure is bomb percentage. Now bomb percentage is just saying that at the start of the level we don't want there to be any bombs on the screen. So that variable is just saying how many bombs are there on the screen, and at the start of a new level we want that value to be 0. Now this one's an interesting variable, because this is where you start to see how proc setup game can be used to create levels, not just for the first level, but for future levels. What the M bomb percentage means is it's the maximum number of bombs that there can be on the screen at any one time. So here you can see that the value of maximum bombs is 6 plus whatever the value of start percentage is. So in our first level, we know that start percentage is 0, because that was actually something that was set by proc play. So proc play sets start to 0. So that means that if proc setup game was setting up the first level, the maximum number of bombs on the screen would just be 6, because obviously 0 plus 6 is 6. But if proc setup was being called to create level 2, then the value of start percentage will now be 1, which means that the maximum number of bombs on the screen can now be 7. So you can see that that's controlling the difficulty setting of the level, and it's quite an ingenious way of doing it. Now the next thing to do is to set up our bombs plural percentage array for the actual bombs themselves. So this is just a simple for loop which is just setting all of the bombs in the bombs percentage array to 0. So it's a way of saying, as well as saying we don't want any bombs on the screen, in terms of the number of on the screen at any given time being 0. We also want to make sure that our bombs percentage array is completely cleared with all values set to 0, because at the very start of the game we don't want there to be bombs falling from the sky straight away. There will be other procedures that control that further down. So that's, if you like, a set of values being initialized. We've then got a few more on line 2260. So here we've got mystery percentage being set to false, and that just means that at the very start of the game we don't want the flying saucer to be present at the top of the screen. That can change very quickly. Obviously this is all happening very fast, but at the very start of the game when we don't want there to be a flying saucer at the top. The next one is setting missile percentage to false. That just means there is no missile in the air, which means that obviously it's the start of the level. A player hasn't yet pressed the fire key, so there are no missiles flying or in flight, so that's set to false. Again, that could change as soon as the player hits the fire key, but at the very start of the level it will be false. And then correspondingly, the X and Y coordinate for a missile in flight is set to 0, because there are no missiles in flight at the start of the game, and therefore we want to make sure that the X and Y position for a missile is 0. As soon as the player hits the spacebar, those values would obviously change, and they're controlled by other procedures in the game. Very importantly, we set the finish variable to false, obviously, because the game level has only just started, so we don't want to set it to true, because that would exit us out of the level. So we set that one to false. And then finally, I think we've seen this one before, the BDU 23100000, that just turns the cursor off. So it just makes sure that the computer cursor is not flashing on the screen. What then happens is a straightforward series of procedure calls, and each one of these procedures is doing a form of drawing on the screen. So you've got proc info line here, which creates the information bar at the top of the screen. So if I go into Cosmic Invaders, this high score and score, that's what the info line is there. Then you've got the proc color setup. What that's doing is basically banding the different colors using the control characters that we've looked at previously. So it's basically saying anything that occupies a particular range of the screen will be red, and then another area will be yellow, and another area will be cyan, and so on. You've then got the invader setup, which is actually drawing the cosmic invaders on the screen. You've got display shields, which is drawing those green blocks at the bottom of the screen. You've then got display invaders. So actually I misspoke a little bit when I said proc invader setup. So proc invader setup is actually setting up the grid, but proc display invaders is then drawing the aliens within that grid. And then finally you've got proc display base, which is displaying the player's base at the bottom of the screen. Just to round off this video, what we're going to do is look at that in slow motion within the BBEM emulator, so that you can effectively see each one of these procedures being called in sequence. Okay, so we start the game. There's proc info line, there's proc display shields. Now we've got proc display invaders, which is actually drawing the cosmic invaders on the screen. And then there's proc display base. So in slow motion, you can see proc info line, which is drawing high score and score at the top, and then obviously the number of lives being displayed at the bottom. Proc display shields creating those green blocks. Proc invader setup and proc display invaders is actually displaying the aliens, and obviously proc display base as the last one on the screen. And that's essentially what those procedures are doing. Now we'll examine the details of the procedures in future videos, but the main thing to understand is that that's what proc setup game is doing and what each of those procedure calls in sequence is doing. So I hope you've enjoyed that, and I hope that you'll join me for the next video in the series. And until then, goodbye.